Have you ever wondered if a common brick in the wall of an old European house could be a monument to human greed and state madness? Imagine a city where the wealthy voluntarily wall themselves into darkness and the poor die of disease simply because the government decided to tax the sun itself. This sounds like the plot of a dystopia, but it is the true story of how a single financial reform permanently altered the face of London, Edinburgh, and Paris. We're used to thinking that architecture is frozen music or a triumph of aesthetics, but in reality, the look of our cities was often dictated not by great architects, but by petty clerks from the tax office, armed with rulers and a thirst for profit. It all began at the end of the 17th century, when England found itself in the classic trap of empire. Plenty of ambition, but no money. On the throne sat William III of Orange, a grim and pragmatic man who desperately lacked the funds for endless wars with France. The state treasury was empty, inflation was eating away at tax revenues, and the good old income tax caused such fury among the population that it was considered an assault on personal liberty. Britons of that time were willing to endure almost anything, but not the intrusion of officials into their private purses and the appraisal of their property. The government needed a brilliant and, most importantly, invisible solution. A tax that would collect vast sums without requiring an entry into the home. In 1696, Parliament passed a decision that seemed logical and even fair at first glance. They introduced the window tax. The logic was cynically simple. A poor man in a hut has one or two windows. A middle-class townhouse has a dozen, and a lord in a manor has hundreds. Windows are visible from the street. They're easy to count without crossing the threshold of private property. It seemed like the perfect luxury tax, designed to hit only the top of the pyramid. But this is exactly where the abyss opened, into which the health of an entire nation collapsed for the next century and a half. This fiscal mechanism was launched by the act of remedying the deficiency of the clipped money, and it instantly turned natural light into a paid resource. As soon as the law took effect, the streets of British cities echoed with the sounds of pickaxes and trowels. But this was not construction, it was a mass dismantling of civilization. People, realizing that every additional hole in the wall would have to be paid for in gold, began to wall up their windows with brick. At first, this affected only those balancing on the brink of poverty, but soon the epidemic of window blindness swept everyone. In the London of that time, strange ghost buildings began to appear, with blind niches instead of glass. Architects like Robert Adam were forced to design new mansions with imitation window openings so that the buildings would not look like fortress dungeons. The paradox was that while the law demanded payment for light, the people chose darkness rather than hand over their shillings to the crown. The situation worsened when the government, having tasted easy money, began to raise the rates. While in 1747, the tax was paid by owners of houses with 10 windows, by the beginning of the 19th century, the threshold was lowered to 7. Treasury officials walked the streets, craning their necks and meticulously recording every glazed space, including tiny vents in pantries and attics. In response, residents showed miracles of ingenuity. They cut internal windows between rooms to somehow distribute the meager light that penetrated through the single remaining legal opening. This led to the popularity of mirror systems and light wells, which did not fall under the formal definition of a window, but allowed people to orient themselves in space during the day. By the middle of the 19th century, this financial experiment had turned into a humanitarian catastrophe. While prime ministers like William Pitt the Younger reported rising budget revenues in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars, cities were turning into breeding grounds for infection. In Victorian London, suffocating in smog, the lack of ventilation became a death sentence. dark, damp apartments, where the last window had been bricked up for the sake of economy, became ideal incubators for tuberculosis, cholera, and typhus. Doctors of the time, including the famous public health reformer Edwin Chadwick, began to sound the alarm, arguing that the window tax was literally a tax on life. Sanitary reports from the 1840s were filled with descriptions of entire families living in basements without a single source of fresh air. The paradox was that the law, intended as a burden on the rich, became a curse for the poor. Owners of tenement houses in the slums of the East End simply bricked up windows to avoid the tax, and their tenants, workers, and immigrants found themselves trapped in stone bags without access to fresh air. It was during this period that the famous idiom daylight robbery was born. People felt the crown had stolen what God had given for free: sunlight. The conflict between the state's fiscal appetite and human biological needs peaked by the middle of the century. Even England's brick factories at the time were working at full capacity not to create new housing, but to stitch up the old. Interestingly, this contagion was not limited to Britain. Revolutionary France, which proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity, introduced its own tax on doors and windows in 1798 under the Directory. French officials went even further. They measured the width of windows, believing that the amount of incoming light directly correlated with a citizen's income. This led to the appearance of famous French facades with narrow, elongated windows that became symbols of thrift. Napoleon Bonaparte, needing millions of francs for his campaigns, kept this tax, realizing that windows were the most obvious and unavoidable evidence of wealth that could not be hidden in a chest. Gradually, architecture became a hostage to bookkeeping. If you look at the mass housing plans of that time, you will see that rooms became longer and narrower. The reason was simple. One window on the end wall illuminated a long corridor, which was paid for as a single unit. Interior design changed as well. White lacquered surfaces, an abundance of porcelain, and light-colored wallpaper appeared, not for beauty, but to maximize the miserable lumens that filtered through the remaining cracks. Glass, which in that era was already expensive due to the excise tax on production, became a symbol not just of wealth, but of political loyalty and a willingness to pay for the right to see the sky. By the mid-1840s, the situation became absurd to the extreme. The British government began classifying even glazed cupboards in walls as windows if they touched an exterior wall. Resistance grew. In Edinburgh, residents began filing mass lawsuits, claiming that the lack of light led to madness and blindness. Newspapers like The Times and Punch were filled with caricatures depicting tax collectors as vampires afraid of the sun. The campaign against the tax united all sorts of people, from radical politicians like Lord Duncan to ordinary housewives. People began to realize that the state was literally draining their health, turning every day into twilight. The climax came during the preparation for the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London. While Britain built Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace, a giant building of glass and light demonstrating technological might, Queen Victoria's ordinary subjects continued to live in the darkness of their bricked-up apartments. The contrast was so monstrous that it became impossible to ignore. While Prince Albert marveled at the transparency of the structures in Hyde Park, a few kilometers away, thousands of people had not seen the sun for weeks. Charles Dickens, in his journal Household Words, launched a fierce campaign, mocking the absurdity of a government that first deprives people of air and then spends money building hospitals to treat consumption. The resolution of this drama was inevitable but difficult. The government resisted for a long time, fearing the loss of a steady income of £1 million annually. However, The wave of protests and the evidence that the window tax directly provoked epidemics forced Parliament to act. In July 1851, the tax was officially repealed and replaced by the inhabited house duty, which no longer depended on the number of openings. Britain literally breathed a sigh of relief. A real boom of unsealing windows began in the cities. Bricks were knocked out, old niches were filled with glass again, and for the first time in a century and a half, the houses became bright. But history left its scars. If you walk through the historic districts of London today, such as Marylebone or Bloomsbury, you will see strange, symmetrically placed brick rectangles on the facades. This is not an architectural whim or a construction defect. These are blind windows, mute witnesses to an era when shadow was free, but light cost a fortune. Many homeowners, after the repeal of the tax, never found the means or the desire to restore the windows, leaving them walled up as a memory of fiscal terror. These empty eye sockets of buildings still look down at us, reminding us of how easily the harmony of life can be destroyed by an ill-conceived line in a budget. The destructive effect of the window tax affected not only architecture and health, but also the psychology of society. For entire generations, a habit was formed of living in semi-darkness, saving on candles, and avoiding open spaces. Even the British culture of cozy fireplaces and heavy curtains stems in part from that era, when any extra opening to the outside world was a source of financial loss. It was a social experiment that showed humans are willing to make colossal sacrifices to save their money, even if those sacrifices are their own eyes and lungs. The story of the window tax teaches us that any decision by authority, even the most rational from a budget math perspective, always generates a chain of unpredictable consequences. We think we manage the world through dry figures and paragraphs of laws, but in reality, people always find a way to adapt, even if the price of that adaptation is their own development and the aesthetics of their cities. True history is not just the dates of great battles we learn in school, but the quiet sound of a trowel against a brick in a dark alley of the 18th century. It is a story of how the struggle for every extra penny in the treasury can deprive a nation of sunlight for centuries. Remember this the next time you open a window in your home. For this right, people once fought an empire without ever leaving their own houses.